Good morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar, Ecological Considerations of Fuel Breaks, presented by Eva Strand and Tim Prather with the University of Idaho and Michele Crist with the Bureau of Land Management. This webinar is the second in our Fuel Break series that will run every week through the end of April, and I'll show you, here's the list of webinars we have going on through the end of April in this series. For details and registration for these webinars, please visit our website at greatbasinfirescience.org. And I believe Corey will put that in the chat for you. Before I introduce our presenters, I will go over some webinar details. We're using Zoom webinar as our platform, and its only drawback is that attendees can't see other attendees. So if you would like, please enter your name and affiliation in the chat so we can have more of a community feel on the webinar. We will also be using the chat for questions, so please type in your questions at any time and I'll field them to the presenters after the presentation. Now I'd like to welcome our presenters. Eva Strand is an associate professor of rangeland ecology and management at the University of Idaho and will present an overview of fuel break ecological considerations. Tim Prather is a professor and senior associate director of the University of Idaho Rangeland Center and will discuss control of cheatgrass and other weeds in fuel breaks. Michele Crist is a landscape ecologist with the Bureau of Land Management's National Interagency Fire Center and will discuss how to use the science framework for fuel break planning. Thank you all for joining us today. And now I'll stop sharing. If you want to go ahead and share, Eva.
Yes. Look good?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. Well, thank you, Janae, for the introduction and for organizing this webinar series on fuel breaks. So ecologically, the Great Basin supports a diversity of plant communities and habitats with over 20 sagebrush species, and each of them, of course, associated with different plant communities. This map shows the major sagebrush types. We've got Wyoming big sage and mountain big sage being the big players. And this is where the BLM have implemented and are planning to implement future fuel breaks. So Chambers and others have described how the sagebrush ecosystems change across this environmental gradient from warmer, drier Wyoming big sage to the cooler, wetter mountain big sage and up to the woodlands at the higher elevations. And key factors include climate, the type and relative abundance of the native plant species, and resistance to invasion by non-native plant species. And knowledge of these factors differ across the landscapes and is important for targeting restoration and conservation efforts, such as the implementation of fuel breaks, and to determine where they are most likely to have ecological and socioeconomic benefits. So let's look at some historical mean fire return intervals. In the mountain big sagebrush, the cooler part of the sagebrush steppe, historically, we used to have fairly short fire return intervals between 11 to 20 years, according to different literature references, while the Wyoming big sagebrush had a longer fire return interval, estimated to be 50 to 100 years. But this has now switched. So the fires in the more mesic shrub steppe have become less common, and fires in the more arid steppe has become more common. So we're losing our sagebrush steppe, both from juniper encroachment and expansion at the higher elevation and from fire and invasive species at the lower elevations. And Jolie showed this map in the last webinar, and it's one of these maps that I just try to show as often as I can. So I was glad to see that she also showed it. This was a map that was first showed at the Missoula conference in 2014, and it looks at historical burn probability ratio to current burn probability. So the areas in bluish green are the areas that we still have a fire deficit, lots of forested areas. But the areas in yellow and red are these areas that are seeing more fire than they used to do historically. And here we are in the Great Basin. And if you compare that to the map here that I got from the Rangeland analysis platform that shows the annual grasses from 2019, you can clearly see that there is a big correlation. If you overlay these maps in the GIS, you'd have a high correlation between cheatgrass and this increase in fire frequency. So the Wyoming big sage fires are becoming more frequent, and they are also becoming larger. And this is, Jeff Rose mentioned this last time, that now we have these mega fires that are larger than 100,000 acres. They have become more of a norm than an exception in the past 15 years. And this is just a list of several of these very large fires in Oregon, Idaho, and Washington, but they are occurring also throughout Utah and Nevada and California as well. So some of the impacts then of these large frequent fires are loss of lives and property. We're jeopardizing firefighter safety, loss of habitats for sagebrush obligate species and other wildlife, disruption to livestock operations on public and private lands with consequences for rural economies, loss of recreational value, decreased resilience, increased recovery times for sagebrush and our native sagebrush steppe, and invasion opens up for invasion to annual grasses. Soil loss as well through wind, erosion, and runoff. And I was at a graduate student seminar, thesis defense actually, just last week. A student was studying medusa head. And at the end of the seminar, he said that it was heartbreaking to see our rangeland degraded to medusa head and cheatgrass thanks to these large fires that we have. And I couldn't agree more than that. So as a response, fuel breaks have been put in across the Great Basin and additional projects are planned. And Jeff Rose described the different types of fuel breaks, the mode break with the intent of shorten the vegetation to reduce fire behavior, brown strips to stop fuel continuity, and green strips where the intent is for them to stay greener later in the year to reduce fire behavior. And I won't go into more detail on that because I think Jeff did a great presentation on that. The intent, maybe to mention that the intent is not necessarily to stop the fire, but to provide a safe area for firefighters to work with the fire. So on to ecological considerations here. One ecological consideration is to evaluate the ecological site that these fuel breaks are traversing. And this map was created by Chambers and others and have been published and is well distributed and shows the resilience to wildfire and the resistance to invasive species among sagebrush types. And the red areas are the less resilient and resistant areas. And the blue are the more higher elevation, cooler, wetter sagebrush that are more resilient to fire and resistant to annual grasses. And if you look at that map, I also found that this map here, just recently published by Shinneman and others in 2019, if you compare these two maps, you can see that it looks like, at least to date, that most of the fuel breaks and the planned fuel breaks are planned in these red areas, so the areas of low resistance and resilience. And that makes sense if you think about that, that's where we have our frequent and large fires. But another consideration that I talked to Justin Beck about is that, or he talked to me about that is actually more difficult to implement fuel breaks in those areas because you have a higher risk for invasion. You might need more herbicide, you might need more frequent maintenance to maintain those fuel breaks. So that's one consideration. So then as far as landscape placement goes, then it makes sense to put fuel breaks in areas that have the propensity for the fire to become large, since that's what we're combating, these large fires. And and also areas that are in this yellow and red area that on the map that Jolie showed that have higher fire frequency. So the low elevation sagebrush with the low R&R, with the thought that implementation might be a little more difficult, or quite a bit more difficult in those areas because of the degraded state. Also need to consider response time for suppression. Areas with high potential to protect valued resources would be desirable, and also take into account, of course, wildlife considerations. So at a finer scale, another thing that I wanted to bring up is, well, what plant species might be suitable to have in these green strips? And these are some properties that would be helpful. Short statured with low volatility to lower flame lengths, disrupt fuel continuity to reduce spread risk, stays green late in the summer, so won't easily ignite and spread fire, not invasive, so they won't alter the adjacent plant communities, native when possible. I put that in there because those native species already occupy an ecological niche in the ecosystems. Suitable for the site level climate and soils, so that gets back to ecological sites, which of course may change along these fuel breaks. The beneficial for wildlife, palatable or provide habitat. And of course, it would need to be practical, affordable, and possible to seed these species in the green strips. Another ecological consideration is the maintenance. How often does these breaks need to be maintained? What are the consequences of not maintaining them? What's the cost? Are there opportunities for targeted grazing? And I know we're going to have a webinar about that here coming up, maybe next time or the time after that. And herbicide treatments, which I know Tim will talk about that here just after me. I also wanted to show this infographic that Shinneman and others presented, and Doug might continue with this. I know he's talking in a couple of webinars as well, but I think they emphasize some important landscape and community scale ecological considerations, that these fuel breaks, they do alter the ecosystem, which may benefit some species, maybe others not. They create edges. They may serve as vectors for wildlife movement and invasive species. Are they fragmenting the landscape, which of course also would depend on what species we're considering. So there will be trade-offs between beneficial and adverse effect. That's what Shinneman and other ends their paper with, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. Another thing I did want to bring up is what is actually the function of fire in sagebrush? I think we maybe tend to forget about that, and we have such large and frequent fires that we often forget what the actual function of fire in sagebrush is. So it is to maintain sagebrush as a cereal vegetation type, and that's particularly important in the mountain big sagebrush, where we have a possibility of encroachment of trees, ponderosa pine, Doug fir, especially maybe juniper and pinyon juniper throughout the Great Basin. To maintain cereal vegetation types within the sagebrush steppe, the grasslands, the grasses, the perennial native grasses are resilient to fire. Divert primary productivity away from woody species towards herbaceous species. Establish recruitment conditions for new cohorts of species, sagebrush, bitterbrush, rabbitbrush, early cereal grasses. This may become more problematic with climate change establishment in some areas. Increase of the FORB component in the community, nutrient cycling, and alterations of fuels. So that's the function of fire in sagebrush, but too much and too large is not benefiting our ecosystems. Are there other complementary approaches? We kind of started to talk a little bit about that last time. Could we use other linear features in the landscape, such as ridgetops, rivers, streams? One problem is that they are often more remote and more difficult to access for firefighters. Keeping more moisture on the landscape, it's the classic range challenge. Invasive species really contribute to drying out our rangelands and lengthening the fire season. Climate change with less snow and earlier snow melt will also make for a drier rangelands and continuing demands from a growing population of water. Are there opportunities with livestock management? Can we use targeted grazing and invasive species management? And we'll have Tim talk about that in the next section here. So I just wanted to finish up my section here by saying that it will be an evaluation. We'll need to be evaluating trade-offs when we choose to put in or not put in these fuel breaks. What are the consequences of not putting them in? We need data and experience to make informed decisions about landscape placement and the type of fuel breaks. And regardless of what approaches we take, collaboration will be important. These large and frequent fires we're contending with are really a wicked problem, and it will take collaboration from all of us to find solutions. And with that, I would like to thank Janae and the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange for inviting me to speak and for organizing these webinars, bringing us together to talk about these important issues.
Thank you, Eva. We really appreciate your talk. All right, so now Tim, as you are sharing your presentation, I forgot to mention earlier that if you have a question, you'll have to choose the all panelists and attendees drop down, because I think the default is just panelists, and so then only we see it and not the rest of the attendees. So just be sure to make that choice in the drop down if you want everyone to see your question. All right, and with that, the floor is yours, Tim.
Thank you. So I will have something to say about cheatgrass, but most of what I'm going to talk about is another one of our invasive annual grasses, which is Ventenata. And so I'm going to focus my efforts there. This is the species I'm talking about, Ventenata dubia, and it is fairly closely related to wild oat. It was at one point put in Avena and then separated out into its own genus, but it is a winter annual grass like both cheatgrass and Medusa head. And what we're finding particularly in northern Idaho and parts of Oregon and Washington, that it is actually replacing both cheatgrass and Medusa head. It has that ability, plus it's been causing considerable problems in both grass, hay, and pasture. And just in a few counties in northern Idaho and eastern Washington, it's caused about $22 million worth of damage on an annual basis. So it's a significant problem and one that's increasing. Just a little background on this particular species. It mostly germinates in the fall. About 10% of it might be in the spring. We know it does require about an inch of rain and soil temperatures above 48 Fahrenheit in order to actually emerge from the soil. Seeds last about 3 years, and they are higher in silica, and that reduces grazing and can make harvest difficult. And we do know that litter protects Ventenata during the winter. And this particular animal did not die because of Ventenata, but this particular canyon grassland right here used to be dominated primarily by Medusa head, and it's now completely, this is all Ventenata here on this particular slide. It's really quite something. If we take a look at where Ventenata is from, we see that it's primarily European. And one of the things that we don't see quite on this particular graph, but it has also been found in North Africa as well, but just along the Mediterranean. But you can see that it spans from Spain all the way over to Iran, and we actually have seen it in Japan. And then it also goes all the way up into Finland. So if you consider both that longitude and latitude range of this particular species, it spans both Mediterranean climates and continental climates. And it also spans from a north to south. It would be equivalent for us to northern Mexico all the way up into northern Canada. So it's got quite a range. When we take a look at its impacts, if we consider canyon grasslands, that's where we were first encountering it. And we take a look at this situation here where we have species richness here and Ventenata, where we have low or no cover, low, which is less than 11%, Ventenata cover, and that's foliar cover, versus a high, which is over 11%. You can see that there's a decline in species richness. That decline is also takes place when it's with respect to native species, and with non-native species, it's not as big of a trend there. But we do see decreasing richness. When we look at the sage steppe, then we see that the same situation holds. We have higher species richness going to lower species richness as we increase Ventenata cover. So we're seeing some fairly significant impacts in both canyon grasslands and sage steppe as well. When we take a look at species that are associated with Ventenata, we find that in the canyon grasslands that medusa head is associated with it, as is Japanese brome. So when we think about the habitats that we would encounter through the sagebrush steppe, we would want to be looking at areas from Japanese brome to medusa head. And when we look at negative association, it's with really snowberry, not a species that we would be thinking we would be encountering in that situation. When we look at sage steppe and we look at positive association, medusa head is still there. So that's one. So where we have medusa head, we might expect to see Ventenata. One that's a negative, which is interesting, is cheatgrass, downy brome here as a negative association. But we think there may be a different reason for why that is. We think it may be a replacement issue, and that is likely in large part because of some soil feedback that's taking place. What we find with Ventenata is that it's mostly stem. There are some leaves. It's a smaller statured grass than either medusa head or cheatgrass. And so we're somewhat puzzled as to how it's become so dominant. And so we've been looking at these soil feedback systems where we take soil from Ventenata. This is the raw soil on this side. And we look at biomass of individual species. So here's cheatgrass here, here's Idaho fescue, sandberg bluegrass, blue bunch wheatgrass, and then Ventenata. So this is soil that's taken from around Ventenata, and you can see the biomass of the plants. And then if we sterilize that soil and take a look at those same species, what you see is cheatgrass has a tremendous response here. Idaho fescue is larger. Sandberg bluegrass, really not much with respect to change there. But you'll notice that both blue bunch wheatgrass and Ventenata are both increasing. So there's something suppressive going on in that situation. But it looks like even in that suppressive situation, it's to the advantage of Ventenata. And so this is something that we're hoping to expand upon. And there's a number of us that are working on annual grass challenges throughout the West. And so we're looking to collaborate on this particular area over the course of this next few years. So if we take a look at control, and so this is looking at both Ventenata and perennial grass, and we're looking at 16 months after it was treated. And these are from studies done in Moscow and Pullman. And so this would be a wetter grassland system. So if we look at not treated, here's the Ventenata. It's, with respect to foliar cover, it's approaching 50 to 60%. And you take a look at the perennial grass cover, it's much lower at less than 20%. If we look at esplanade, and this is the newer herbicide, the active ingredient is called indaziflam, and Esplanade is also going to be marketed as Rejuvra, and so most of what we would utilize is going to be actually Rejuvra in our rangeland settings. And you can see that 16 months after treatment, when we look at the amount of Ventenata, it's very low, and you can see that there's been a tremendous response in the foliar cover of grasses from this to this, whether it's 5 ounces or 7 ounces. Another herbicide matrix, or Laramie, which is rimsulfuron, is another one that after 1 year, it starts to break down with respect to control. So you can see that the Ventenata is coming back, but we are still seeing some response here with the perennial grasses. And that's also true when we get to a higher rate of that matrix. And then if we look at combinations of Esplanade and matrix, you can see that we maintain that low amount of Ventenata, and we see a higher amount of perennial grass. And this occurs over the course of several years. The Esplanade is very long-lived in the soil. If we take a look at Plateau, which is commonly used in sage steppe, you can see that after 16 months, it's acting pretty much like these others. And this would be, I think this is a 6 ounce rate of Plateau. So you can see that it looks a lot similar to what the matrix does. If we look at 2 years after application, this is another study. And so this indaziflam is the Rejuvra or Esplanade. And you can see that in the untreated, there's a 100% cover. And then here, if we look at a timing of September, that 2 years after application, there's no plants at all, whether it's indaziflam or indaziflam plus rimsulfuron, so Laramie or matrix. The Mazapic, we're back up to 78% cover after 2 years. But you can see here, when we get to this October treatment, you can see that we still have very good control. Again, Plateau, we're at 96% cover, so this did not work well, whereas the indaziflam did work really well. So what we're finding is that regardless of the timing, the indaziflam or indaziflam plus another herbicide works really quite well. And so when we think about FuelBreak treatments or just sagebrush treatments in general, these are some pretty good treatments to consider. Well, we've also taken a look at aerial application. And so with this, we wanted to look at different carrier rates, and these go from 2.5 gallons up to 20 gallons per acre. And these flights, we had to do multiple passes in order to achieve that. But we looked at both fixed wing and helicopter. And the idea was to keep the same rate of indaziflam or indaziflam plus imazipic, which is Plateau, so Rejuvra or Rejuvra plus Plateau. And here's our area. This is at the Rock Creek Ranch, and you can see the various treatment regimes. They're long strips where we applied with either fixed wing or with helicopter. And then we did some in-field assessments. And what we found was with respect to annual grass control, that if we look at percent annual grass control, we had lower control if we had a 2.5 to 5 gallon per acre rate of water applied with the 5 ounces of Rejuvra. And then as we increased, we saw that the control increased. If we added imazipic, we see that that rate of control goes up. You can see that here. And the reason for that is that indaziflam is not very mobile. And so for that first year of treatment, you want to have something else with it if you're going at a lower carrier rate, because there's more distance between droplets on the ground. And so that Plateau helps with that. And then as the indaziflam spreads out, we're hoping that it continues to control the annual grasses. And this is primarily with cheatgrass, this particular annual control. So here's 90% control and less than 80% control. If you look at changes in perennial grass cover, you can see that we had an increase in perennial grass cover here, an increase in perennial grass cover with ground applications. So airplane, helicopter was kind of a mixed bag, probably about the same. And let's see if there's anything else. And what we found overall with species richness, it tended to be mimicking this as well. So we're finding that we actually are increasing our perennial grass cover even after 1 year after treatment, and we're removing the cheatgrass. And in this case, the species that we had were blue bunch and sandbird bluegrass and basin wild rye, squirrel tail, and then also Columbia needlegrass were the species. And I think that's all I had for the presentation for today.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. And there's some good questions coming in, and we'll address all the questions after Michele's talk. So Michele, if you want to screen share now.
Hi, yes. Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
Okay.
Looks great.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to present. So my talk today is on how to use the science framework for FuelBreak planning.
Michele, if you don't mind, it sounds like there's like a fan or something in the background.
You know, that's my computer. And
Oh, okay.
unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about it. The fan kicked in. I apologize for that.
That's okay. All right, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I've heard that before, that it sounds like a waterfall. So sagebrush ecosystems are one of the most endangered ecosystems in the Western United States. And this is largely due to the invasion of highly flammable exotic annual grasses in the western part of the sagebrush biome, where grasses like cheatgrass are resulting in more frequent and larger fires, and in some cases, wholesale conversion to annual grasses. So over the past 2 decades, more area has burned in sagebrush systems than in forested systems. And between 2000 and 2018, over 15 million acres have burned, and most of it in Nevada, Oregon, and Idaho. And as a result, we're seeing increased risk to human life and property, high fire management costs, and loss of economic and cultural resources. So to address this problem, large-scale linear FuelBreak networks are being proposed as a potential solution. Goals for implementation of large-scale linear FuelBreak networks include first, to reduce the extent of uncharacteristic wildfire in the sagebrush biome, and also protect species habitats such as greater sage-grouse, reduce our fire suppression costs, and also provide a safe and effective response to wildfire. However, there are a lot of questions still about FuelBreaks. One is, where should FuelBreak networks be placed? How many FuelBreaks do we need? Are they effective at reducing wildfire extent overall in sagebrush systems? And can we ensure a commitment to funding their long-term maintenance? And in addition, there are a few trade-offs to consider as well. There's limited research on FuelBreak impacts and effectiveness. There's the potential for further loss and fragmentation of greater sage-grouse and other sagebrush obligates habitat. And there's a potential vector for spread of planted non-natives and invasives. And so here, I believe that the science framework will really help address many of these questions and trade-offs that are associated with FuelBreaks. So the science framework, the conservation and restoration of the sagebrush biome, was developed by an interagency team of approximately 40 scientists and managers to help address the many risks to sagebrush ecosystems. Part 1 by Chambers et al. Was published in 2017 and provides a synthesis of these risks and the impacts to ecosystems and species. It also provides analytical approaches and decision tools to help managers prioritize where to manage these risks. Part 2 by Crist et al. Was published in 2019, and it provides management considerations and strategies for applying the science in Part 1. So this strategic multi-scale approach presents a new management paradigm for agencies and managers. It is underpinned by research on resilience to disturbance and resistance to invasive annual grasses. This research provides information first on an area's recovery potential, essentially how it is going to respond to disturbance such as wildfire, and second on how resistant or susceptible it is to invasive annual grasses in sagebrush ecosystems. And so the science framework uses this information to help managers prioritize areas for management across large landscapes and locate management actions where they will have the greatest impact and determine the most effective management strategies. It also provides information at 3 different scales, the sagebrush biome scale, which is across the Western US, the mid-scale, which can be considered ecoregions, and also the local scale or project sites. So the basis for Part 1 is the creation of a spatial conservation framework that provides maps and a matrix for using resilience and resistance as a decision tool to prioritize areas for different types of management. This sagebrush habitat resilience and resistance matrix shown here combines our understanding of resilience and resistance with information on sagebrush and sage-grouse habitat. So the rows show relative resilience and resistance of sagebrush ecological types ranging from high, moderate, and low, and the columns represent sage-grouse breeding habitat probabilities ranging from low, moderate, and high. So if we first look at the rows in blue with high R&R, or resilience and resistance, these areas are characterized by cool and moist soil moisture temperature regimes. And because of this, they have a high resilience to disturbance and high resistance to invasive annual grasses, and thus have a high potential for recovery after disturbance. Whereas the rows in red are characterized by warm and dry sites, which have a low resilience to fire and a low resistance to invasions. And thus the recovery of these areas is quite low after disturbance. And so this matrix here can be easily adapted for other species or other values that may be at risk. And part 2 of the science framework focuses on management considerations and trade-offs for applying the scientific information in part 1. It has individual sections that were written by manager and research teams on all of the key resource management topics that are shown here in this graphic. They include monitoring and adaptive management, climate adaptation, wildfire and vegetation management, non-native invasive plant management, application of national seed strategy concepts, livestock grazing management, wild horse and burrow consideration, and last but not least, a section that discusses the integration of the management strategies for all the sections and describes their associated trade-offs. There are 6 sections within part 2 that would be incredibly helpful for FuelBreak planning and implementation. And these 6 sections include wildfire and vegetation management, non-native invasive plant management, national seed strategy concepts, monitoring and adaptive management, climate adaptation, and also the integration and trade-offs. And so in the next slides, I'm just going to go through these sections individually and pull out just some general information that's relevant for field break planning and implementation at multiple scales. So for the science framework, we developed a Greater Sage-Grouse wildfire risk assessment. And this was based on the premise that risk is equal to probability of a threat and consequences of that threat, whether they be negative or positive. And this assessment here combines three factors: the probability of wildfire, the consequences of fire to locations of greater sage-grouse breeding habitats, and then we modify those consequences based on a habitat's resilience to fire and resistance to invasive grasses. And so this wildfire risk map at a very broad scale distinguishes between habitats at risk to fire and their capacity to recover from fire and resist annual grass invasions, and can be used to target wildland management actions such as field break implementation. So the circled area here in the map on the left are areas that are highly vulnerable to fire. They have a combination of high to moderate burn probability, high to moderate sage-grouse habitat probability, and low to moderate resilience and resistance. And these areas really should be considered the higher priorities for management, including strategic placement of fuel reduction treatments and field breaks around these sage-grouse habitats. And so in section 4 on wildland fire and vegetation management, this section provides considerations for prioritizing this field break placement and implementation. And here, the overall goal of these fuel reduction and field break strategies is to strategically place treatments so that they collectively disrupt connected fields and allow a safe space for fire suppression efforts. And some of these low value greater sage-grouse habitats that are kind of shown in orange that have a high probability of fire are the highest priorities for siting the fuel reduction and field break projects, especially where they are located and adjacent to the high value greater sage-grouse habitats with moderate to high fire risk and low R&R that are in need of protection. And these areas are actually shown in the best colors in the map. So in section 5 has a matrix that highlights management strategies based on non-native annual grass invasion states and resilience and resistance. So here in this matrix, thresholds range from invasion-free to an invasion-dominated state. And the columns show high resilience and resistance in blue, moderate in yellow, and low in red. And so I'm going to highlight where field break implementation strategies are provided in this matrix, so that they can help, some of these strategies will help reduce the spread of invasives, either within the field breaks, but also within the vegetation adjacent to the field breaks. So for example, in areas that have a low to moderate resilience and resistance, invasion-dominated state, management considerations are to place field breaks around the perimeters of these invaded areas. And then in areas that are relatively invasion-free and also have a moderate state of invasion, the management strategies would be to consider placing field breaks to help reduce the spread of invasives, to avoid field break placements that connect invaded and uninvaded areas. And then for areas with minimal and also mild invasion states, we should locate and maintain field breaks that would help prevent invasive plant spread. And then section 6 on our national seeding strategies discusses the considerations and trade-offs involved in seeding native versus non-native seeds. So in this section, there is a matrix for comparing seed options of locally seed sourced to non-native, and also has local level considerations for selecting seed sources and types. This matrix also gives certainty in deciding what type of seed species to use in a project, such as establishing field breaks. And section 6 also provides information and links on plant traits for the selection of native and non-native plant materials that can be used for field breaks. It illustrates that plant traits that can help reduce flame lengths within field breaks and allow for more control in wildland fire operation efforts in suppressing wildfire. These plant traits, such as establishment and persistence, drought tolerance, plant height, competitiveness with invasives, can all be helpful in choosing native and non-native plants for field break planning. And in our section 2 on monitoring, this section steps through the process of learning by doing, using the adaptive management cycle. So this section provides information on how monitoring strategies can help increase our knowledge on field break effectiveness and also provide needed maintenance schedules so that these field breaks are ready to be used in a wildfire event. It provides information on the different types of monitoring, such as condition and trend and treatment effectiveness. And it discusses how to effectively monitor at different landscape scales and provides examples of monitoring metrics and how to quantify these metrics. And in section 3, provides information on climate change and adaptation for sagebrush ecosystems. And this information can be used for scenario planning for field break implementation into the future. So for example, it provides information on how climate suitability for cheatgrass increases with projected decreasing summer precipitation. And in the last section, section 9, here we pull all of the management considerations across all of these different management topics. And we developed a management consideration matrix that describes the associated trade-offs and also the associated benefits with integrating the management considerations across the different topics. So the management consideration matrix does provide information on the potential benefits as well as the associated trade-offs with field break implementation. And so, for example, benefits would include the ability to manage wildfire in the context of longer and hotter wildfire seasons due to climate change, with the use of field breaks. And then also how field breaks may potentially reduce fire expense and reduce loss of greater sage-grouse habitats to fire. At the same time, there are some trade-offs. And some of these trade-offs include wildlife species habitat loss and fragmentation. It could be a potential vector for an increase in the spread of invasives. And again, there needs to be a commitment to the long-term maintenance of field breaks. And so in summary, the science framework part 1 and part 2 can be used in many ways for field break planning and implementation. And it helps address many of the questions and trade-offs associated with field breaks. This multi-scale approach can inform different aspects of field break planning and implementation, ranging from budget prioritization, prioritization of management actions, and selection of project sites, and management strategies and treatments. It can also be used for many decision-making processes, such as NEPA and land management planning. And in addition to the science framework, BLM Fire and Aviation has been investing in much research concerning field break implementation and effectiveness. And presentations on this research are being featured in this webinar series. So I hope you will tune in for those presentations as well. And so with that, I'll end here and just say thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was great. All right, we have a lot of great questions, so I will just start right at the top. The first question was for Eva, and when you talk about fuel breaks, are you talking about fuel breaks or a combination of fuel breaks and fire breaks?
It's all about fuel breaks. Yeah, I think this whole webinar series is about fuel breaks.
Great, thanks for that clarification.
I think I actually put fire breaks. I saw that in one of the slides, so I need to change that.
Okay, thanks. All right, Tim, and I think that you might have answered this, but just so that everyone can hear the answer. Fascinating soil feedback effect. Did you heat soils to sterilize them? And is it possible that the resulting changes in soil fertility cause some annual grasses to increase?
Sure. Yeah, I can answer that. I think that when you do heat soil, and that's how we did do the sterilization, that you can change some of the soil properties. I don't think it was nutrient changes in this instance. I think it was likely a result of changes in the microflora, and we're not sure if that would be fungal or bacterial, but we're sending those samples off for analysis to see what species were represented in that soil. We have done studies previously where we extracted fusarium from the tissues of Ventenata and inoculated seeds of a range of species with those. And in this case, it was a fusarium, and it did not affect Ventenata, but it killed about 60% of the blue bunch wheatgrass. We have not found that same fusarium everywhere. And so that's why we're looking at this soil feedback as a way to get at this. And we'll be trying to sample a range of soils to see if this is a mechanism by which Ventenata is being successful.
Great, thanks. And you might have answered this in that response, but the next question was, there's a soil pathogen that increases native grass mortality and reduces fitness, but doesn't have a huge effect on cheatgrass survival. The cause of, oh my gosh, I'm gonna forget all of my plant acronyms, but PSSP,
Yeah, that's
FEID.
bunch wheatgrass.
Yeah, that's right. FEID, which one's that one?
Fescue.
Yeah, fescue and Ventenata increase could be released from the soil pathogen via soil sterilization. Have you looked at that?
That's certainly a possibility, and it could be the same pathogen. It could be a different one. There's we know very little about soil microbiology in general, and so it could be a related one. It could be a completely different genus. We just don't really know at this point, but it's something that we're wanting to explore.
Great. Next question is also for you. Do you think the rock, is that creek, CK, herbicide results would hold in the drier sagebrush steppe areas where fuel breaks are being installed so much, or are there reasons to think the results could differ a little?
Sure. Yeah, this is at the Rinker Rock Creek Ranch, which is just outside of Haley, and it is a wetter environment. It's primarily mountain big sage, and it goes into low sage and some of the shallower soils. I would anticipate that the control would stay about the same and would probably actually get better, just based on some of the discussions I've had with or at least one discussion that I've had with Matt Termino that suggests that what we see with plateau is that it's a very short-lived control, and yet in drier sage steppe, it seems to last longer. So I'm going to anticipate that these other treatments would also last longer as we get into drier habitats.
Great, thank you. The next question was a question for someone to speak about fuel break width. And Eva or Michelle, you could probably answer that, but I might just jump in that this question was asked on the last webinar last week. And so I looked up the answer, and it depends. So the width of a fuel break, you know, some people throw around a number between 100 and 300 feet, but that just totally depends on the site and access for firefighters and things like that. So I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add to that one.
Yeah, it's going to depend. And if you're thinking of a fuel break, it could be thought of as either a barrier or a conduit to movements of different species. And it just depends on the movement of those species, how they traverse across landscapes, if it would act as a break or fragmenting that landscape for that species or not. So it depends is a good answer. And the same thing, I think, with the breaks and considering spotting during a fire, I think is one of these kind of big questions that we have, you know, under what conditions will this fuel break really stop the fire or not allowing the fire to cross.
Great, thank you. Michelle, the next question's for you. Most of the large wildfire events in sagebrush caused by high winds pushing fires that push embers a pretty far distance. Is there work done to know how far hot embers travel in the winds before cooling enough not to spark fires in annual grass and sagebrush?
I would say that that's an area that would be ripe for research. We have some ideas on how far those, you know, that spotting will occur, but more information on that would be incredibly helpful, especially in thinking about fuel break implementation.
Great, thank you. It looks like there was a clarifying question for Tim about your biomass slide. Oh, you might have answered this already, but let me just ask it. I was wondering if when you sterilize the soil, if you think it could be a release from a pathogen that allowed the grasses to increase in biomass relative to the non-sterilized soil.
That's what we think is going on when we talk about these soil feedback systems. We think that that's the case. We have looked at nutrients in sage steppe, and one of the things that we found was when we had lower phosphorus levels, that seemed to be where we had higher incidence of Ventenata. So there is a nutrient piece to this as well, but we're not sure that that's the cause for its success, but it may contribute to it.
Great, thanks. And this a question for anyone. What are some of the common causes of large fire events?
What are some of the causes? Well, there's, you know, really, I think there's two main causes, and that would be natural, you know, lightning caused fires, as well as human ignitions, you know, and depending on the geographic region, you know, some of those human ignitions could range from 40% of the fires all the way up to like 98% of the fires. And so in more populated areas, more of our fires are human caused, whereas when you are in the more remote areas are where the lightning ignitions generally start.
And then I imagine in combination with the starts is the weather events at the time. Okay, thank you. Let's see. Michelle, if I'm reading your maps correctly, it appears many of the proposed fuel breaks are located in high, medium resilience and resistance and lower burn probability. Is that correct?
Yes, I would say that, you know, when I overlaid the map of wildland fire risk assessment map, and then with all of the fuel breaks that have been proposed, that there were definitely some of them that fell within those areas of a lower fire probability and a higher resilience and resistance. And I think here, you know, using this type of fire risk assessment, it's an opportunity to really prioritize where we should be putting in these fuel breaks first. You know, putting these fuel breaks in areas where there is that higher fire probability, and where we want to protect some of our resources that we don't want to lose. And so it's really just using this fire risk assessment as a prioritization tool for those field breaks.
Great, and I think as Jolie Paulet mentioned last week, that not all of the proposed fuel breaks are going in immediately. There's a process for which ones get put in, and that's ongoing.
Exactly. And you know, and that will be up to the state offices as well as the local field districts in what they feel to, you know, in what it is that they need there on the ground.
Great, thanks. Next question. My impression is that fuel breaks occur primarily along existing roads. Does the addition of the fuel break really increase fragmentation more than the road already did?
Yeah, I think, yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
No, you can go ahead. I'll answer after you.
Well, I think that kind of relates to the first question where we talked about the width of the fuel breaks and how different organisms might interpret that width in different ways. So Michelle, you might have something to add to that.
Well, I was going to answer with exactly what you said. It really depends on the organism. And you know, and sometimes it also depends on you know, what the organism is doing at the time in terms of its movement across the landscape, you know. And for sage grouse, you know, they can fly, for instance. So, you know, a lot of people think, oh, well, they can just fly over the field breaks. But at the same time, when some of these hens, you know, they have their broods, they can't fly because the broods can't fly yet. And so if they are in areas where there is a low cover, for instance, they could be at risk to predation. So it definitely is, it depends on the organism.
Great, thank you. Michelle, you mentioned a risk assessment. Is this a West-wide assessment?
Yes, it is. It is. And I have a variety of these types of risk assessments because I've been playing around with them. So that one that I showed was for greater sage-grouse habitat. I also have one just for sagebrush ecosystems as well. That's a little more generalized, but it combines the concepts of resilience and resistance with these sagebrush ecosystems and then their fire probability.
Great, thank you. Another question for you, Michelle. How does the adaptive management framework apply to permanent or semi-permanent features like fuel breaks that you can't move or redo? Does the adaptation adjustment apply to future fuel break placement instead of existing fuel breaks? And thank you for the great talk.
Okay. I would say yes, that is exactly it. You know, some of these fuel breaks may be more permanent features there on the landscape, and the monitoring and the use of adaptive management cycle is what we learn from the monitoring of those more permanent features can be applied to the placement of these fuel breaks in the future, or looking at the effectiveness of these fuel breaks and kind of find like, oh, they're working here, but maybe they're not working so well here. Or maybe this plant material worked here, but it's not working here. You know, so that's where monitoring and the adaptive management cycle really comes into play.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Oh, the science framework is available online. And Corey, if you don't mind looking it up real quick and pasting it in the chat, that would be really great. But yes, it's also online. It's searchable on our website as well. So I can get that link out. Let's see. Thank you for the great information. Another, oh, time competing for Zoom, not a question, just more Zoom events coming up. Let's see, so I think this is the last one. How does fuel break location take into consideration predictions for sage-grouse population centers and priority habitat to move in response to changing climate?
You know, I would almost have to see that question written out to be able to help answer it.
Yeah, how does, let's see, how does fuel break location take into consideration predictions for sage-grouse population centers and priority habitat to move? So I guess how does placement of fuel breaks now, how are we thinking about that in relation to changing climate?
into changing climate. I think, well, that's where I think right now, you know, it's a little bit early to say exactly what we will be doing in that regard. But in the science framework, we do have some of that information on climate change and climate adaptation. So when you are thinking about how our climate changes and it's moving, you know, we can look at some of these field breaks and see, you know, where are the ones that we are still in need of utilizing for wildfire responses, whereas those maybe we need new ones to be put in other areas and potentially retire other ones where maybe these fires aren't occurring as frequently. And so that's a good topic discussion for sure.
Great. Well, that was the last question. Thank you all so much for your wonderful presentations. And thanks for the audience participation, great discussion. And we'd greatly appreciate it if you would take our 3-question survey that will appear after I close the webinar. And this recording will be posted on our Great Basin Fire Science YouTube channel within the next couple of days. And actually, no, I guess we have to do it today or tomorrow morning because the link will automatically be sent to you through the Zoom follow-up system tomorrow. Yeah, if you have any further questions about this or other webinars, please email or call me anytime. And again, thank you all for attending this webinar, and thank you, Eva, Tim, and Michelle for presenting.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you, Janae. Thank you. Bye-bye.